everyone. Thank you for listening to me in English. I appreciate that immensely. It's wonderful to hear a little bit more about Zolu Holding and any company that has a CFO so actively involved in the sustainability agenda, I think has to be worth watching. I also just want to acknowledge the extraordinary work that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and here represented through its Turkish arm, and the UN Global Compact have done, again represented through the Turkish arm. I'm going to just very quickly run you through some slides, hopefully, and very happy to accept or answer questions later on. My theme is
John, maybe
yes.
we can also say that if they have any questions during your talk, they can write on the chat panel. Then
of course.
Yes.
Yeah, no. So if anyone does have questions, please put them in the chat panel, and either directly during the event or afterwards, I'll do my best to answer them. So in different parts of the world, people are opening their curtains in the morning and seeing sites rather like this. I have many friends on the Pacific coast of the United States. This is a picture out of one of their bedroom windows. We live in an extraordinary time where things that have been warned about for a very long time are becoming a reality. And this diagram, I think many of us have seen similar diagrams, but it just shows over the next few decades what the gap is between the sort of trend lines, the trajectories that we're currently on, and where we would need to get to in order to address the climate emergency, and particularly the blue line, to get down to 1.5 degrees. But first, just a quick couple of comments about who I am. I love your part of the world. Let me just say that I was partly brought up in the Eastern Mediterranean, so it's a part of the world I love. But what I'm going to talk about today is not so much the Mediterranean as the world and the challenges that it faces. And this book, Green Swans, just came out in April through Fast Company Press. And so I'm going to talk about some of the themes in there. But in terms of what I've done over the years and indeed decades, most of my work has been with business, often at board level or C-suite level. This is a photograph from a number of years ago. It shows obviously Michael Porter and C.K. Prahalad when he was alive. And this was working with Nestle on their Creating Shared Value Forum, which I did for 9 years and very much enjoyed. But what we saw there was a collision. We saw a tension between different ways of thinking about value and about what capitalism does. And so the three diagrams here show that the sort of almost the Milton Friedman view, that there is a business world and it has a single financial bottom line, and there are these other bits round about. And then the shared value world, which Michael Porter and Mark Kramer promoted, where things gradually overlap, and that's a good thing. But there's a group called the Future Fit Foundation, which now uses the diagram shown, or the map shown on the right, where instead of these things overlapping, they're nested, they're sort of concentric circles. And I think that's increasingly how we're going to have to think about value. So the recall of the triple bottom line was mentioned. I'm just going to say something very brief about that and why I recalled it 2 years ago. It was the first ever product recall of a management concept, according to the Harvard Business Review, which published the piece. The original idea was, and the cartoon comes from 1991, a long time ago, and it was the idea was that boards and corporate suites, C-suites, would have to get used to listening to very different voices of nature, of the social agenda, and that the robot was there really almost as a joke, but it was a symbol for the deep future. It's no longer a joke. Many of you will know that in 2014, the first board in the world, it was in Hong Kong, appointed an expert system to its board. Salesforce in the United States is working on a generation of expert systems specifically designed to help boards called Einstein. So things are changing, and they're changing quite fast. And you can't really withdraw a concept like the triple bottom line. There are now something over 3,500 companies, and a number of the organizers of this event are involved in the B Corporation movement, the 3,500 B corporations around the world. This is one of their events a couple of years ago, and it just shows the momentum, I think indeed the excitement in that movement. So you can't withdraw the idea, but at the same time, you're starting to see mainstream media raising the same questions. So for example, the Financial Times a couple of years ago again talked about capitalism needing a reset. That was unparalleled at that time, but it wasn't simply a front cover. They've set up a virtual platform to publish content on the sorts of agenda and issues and challenges and opportunities that other speakers have already addressed. And just last week, many of you may have seen in the New York Times an advertisement marking, not celebrating, the 50th anniversary of the New York Times piece by Milton Friedman, which laid out the case for a single bottom line. I think we're coming to the end of the Friedman paradigm. Brilliant man, but in some ways, some of his disciples have taken us in very dangerous directions. So I think what we're now seeing is a need for the triple bottom line, if it's to be used and used effectively, a need for it to be used in 3 different frames. Responsibility is where it's operated for about 30 or 40 years now, and that's fine. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, or during it, we're seeing the responsibility agenda expanding to wealth divides, to public health care provision divides, to tax evasion. Look at President Trump, perhaps at the moment. But that only takes you so far. And what we are also hearing many people talking about in business, in politics, in government, and in the financial markets, they're talking about resilience. And there's a guy, Roger Martin, a Canadian academic, who's talked for years about the way in which globalization, through the pressure to drive efficiency, has squeezed resilience out of all sorts of systems. Now, the only way I know of getting to better resilience over time is to regenerate, to invest in the systems that provide that resilience. So economic, social, environmental, political governance, and so on. So that, for me, is where we need to head next. So has the pandemic killed sustainability? The simple answer, if you read, for example, what the Gates Foundation has recently been saying, and think about Alexandra's, the challenges that she portrayed, is it's set it back very, very severely. So 25 years of progress wiped out in 25 weeks. So that's pretty negative. At the same time, however, it's extraordinary in the pandemic to see, for example, the ESG, environment, social and governance investment movement, actually doing better than many of the non-ESG alternatives. And these 3 dimensions of value coming through now very strongly indeed. Now, you still have stupidities. You still have idiotic companies like Rio Tinto blowing up 46,000-year Aboriginal caves. I mean, how could they? But nonetheless, I mean, people do continue to make mistakes. But at the same time, what you're seeing is a very different set of leadership initiatives. So, for example, last week again, many of you will know that the CEO of Walmart, the largest retailer in the world, announced that Walmart was committing to becoming a regenerative company. How extraordinary is that? That is really quite a remarkable commitment. We'll see where that gets them. Now, where are we in all of this? In the book Green Swans, the first diagram is roughly this diagram, which suggests that we're not in a shallow recovery, something that will bounce back with a V shape, a W shape, a U shape, whatever. We're actually in a very major shift in our economies, which, if we're lucky, may take 12 to 15 years to crank through. And in many ways, and it's that shift is now taking many of our societies down into that red line at the bottom. The public are confused, they're fearful, they're increasingly, in some countries, quite angry. And COVID-19 has accelerated all of that. Now, on the other side of this U-bend, there's a very different economy. And I think where we got to get is there, and CSR, corporate social responsibility, and citizenship and so on, are part of the story. But most of what we're doing under the title Sustainable Development is not properly going to get us there. So very quickly, the Sustainable Development Goals have already been referenced. Many business people, and I've seen many companies doing this, treat them as incremental goals. They ask themselves the question, what are we already doing and how does that map onto these 17 goals? And we do partnerships, so we've got 17 already. But if you just look at the first two goals, no poverty and zero hunger, both by 2030, those have to be exponential goals. Who's thinking about them in that way? So far, very few people indeed. And part of the reason is that thinking about exponential trends is really hard. Our brain is not good at doing that. So Gula, you went to Singularity University. I've seen a growing number of business leaders doing the same, trying to get their brains around the exponential change agenda. And I think many more need to do that. And that's towards the conclusion where I think we're now heading. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb, very well known, wrote a book called The Black Swan, published in 2007, and talked about events, and this was just ahead of the financial crash, events that were a complete surprise, had an extreme impact, and which afterwards we'd look back at and think we'd understood, but very often not understood properly at all. So setting ourselves up again for failure. So my question in Green Swans was, if black swans largely take us exponentially where we don't want to go, what sort of trajectories, what sort of solutions, what sort of business models and so on, what sort of economics might take us in exponentially in directions that we do want and need to go? So I'm not going to read out the definitions, just simply to say these are not individual companies, these are not individual leaders, these are market shifts that we're talking about. And when I'm asked, give an example, for example, the European Union's 1.82 trillion euro green recovery deal would for me be an example, potentially at least, of a green swan. Another one, there are many technologies now, particularly those that have a digital core, which are going on to exponential trends. And we all know that wind power, solar power shown here, battery technology, all of these things are going on really quite spectacular cost reduction curves. We've got to be very careful in all of this, though, because for every green swan, you're going to have black feathers, or even in some cases, black wings. And one of the things that we're finding is in solar and in wind, for example, and batteries, we don't know what to do with these bits of equipment at the end of their working life. They're not properly part of the circular economy. So we've got to pay a lot more attention. And then just finally, a few points. One is, I think whatever sector of industry you are operating in, whatever geography you're operating in, and if you're a business leader, a proper business leader, you're going to have to learn to speak the language of impact. Doesn't matter whether you're an impact investor, this is something you have to do. There's a new book that's just come out from one of the leading and early impact investors, Sir Ronald Cohen, shown here. And the book is called Impact, and I recommend it very highly. I hope it comes out in a Turkish edition. Something else that I find incredibly exciting is that young people now get this agenda. They understand it. This is their reality. This is their future. They want to be involved. So what we're increasingly seeing is companies. This is the Spanish infrastructure and renewable energy company, Acciona, are starting to bring their younger people, their fast-track managers and so on, into decision-making at an earlier stage to focus on some of the issues that we're discussing today. I also think 2050 is too late for much of this. If we leave our deadlines, our time horizons to 2050, we're not going to make this transition in good order and good time. We need to go for net zero throughout our value webs very much more rapidly than most people can currently imagine. We've got to radically shrink the environmental footprints of our businesses, and we've got to move from responsibility to regeneration. Now, my last slide is this one. Earlier this year, for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we did a paper as part of their Vision 2050 refresh, looking at the impact and implications of COVID-19. I recommend that paper. I had nothing to do particularly with writing it. I just think it's a good piece of analysis. And on the right, you have a mapping. Now, there's no time scale on this. This might be decades, it might be longer, but what we're seeing here is a shift from a world in which responsibility was the main focus of what business did into a world where resilience is an increasing concern because things are starting to wobble. Our biosphere is wobbling, our economy is wobbling, globalization isn't doing what we thought it would do, populists are coming up in all sorts of places. So we're moving into a very challenging time. And as I said, the only way to get out of that trap is to switch to regeneration, as Walmart have just done. And just final comment, that all of the data points on these three horizons, three curves, were produced by company people when we worked through them and used this map, and also by one regulatory authority, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I will do my very best to answer any questions. So, Gule, if I can hand back to you, please.
Yeah, John, thanks so much for this inspiring and mind-opening talk. It's really give us a great insight, especially during these days. I'm sure you are talking to many people, many organizations in different countries worldwide. And then I'm also sure that you have a sense of understanding the maturity of the countries, organizations in different economies. Can you name some organizations or countries that you think that the maturity is better than the others?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because if I start to name particular Scandinavian companies as the world leaders, I'm going not to be terribly popular.
But maybe some economies, because we have some understanding that these issues, this type of developments are happening in the advanced economies. Yeah. We are in an emerging economy, so I just want to see that whether this kind of
course,
in a way, stereotyping is right.
It's a great question, and I think if you think about social enterprise, for example, very often you find that the countries that are leading in those spaces these days are countries like Brazil. They're countries like India, they're countries like Indonesia. So if you're looking particularly at how we address social problems of the sort that Alexandra referenced in an entrepreneurial way, those sorts of countries are well worth looking at. But when I think about green swans, I don't simply think about the European Union with its Green Deal. I think about places like China. Now, China has an extraordinary renewable energy industry. We all know that, and solar, wind, batteries. They've just piled into that space. Now also electric vehicles. They're planning in many ways to try and dominate the global market for electric vehicles and everything that goes with that, the artificial intelligence and the software, the smart grid technology and so on. But when I think of China, I also think of something else, which is the Han people, the sort of the original Chinese people came from the Loess Plateau, and the Loess Plateau was wrecked. It was destroyed by generations, centuries of over-exploitation by the Han people. And what the Chinese have been doing is investing in that enormous area of basically desert and bringing it back to forests, bringing it back to agriculture, and places where this is done, you start to get the rain patterns coming back again. So when I'm talking about regeneration, there are many, many different examples. And finally, one of the things that we've just done is to set up a green swan observatory to track examples in every geography and every sector around the world, and develop case studies and information around who's trying to do what's working, and critically, what's not working, and what can we learn from that.
I mean, of course, highlighting some success stories, I'm sure, would also encourage other companies and also countries as well. We have few questions from the audience. The first one is, how do you explain the supporting roles of government, civil society, private sector in making this shift possible?
It's a great question. And part of the reason I reference Milton Friedman is not that I hate him, and not that I think he was a stupid man. As I said, he was a very brilliant man, but he had a very dangerous influence in a way on the way that economists and business people think. And one of the things he's best remembered for is his saying that if you put in the United States, the federal government in charge of the Sahara, you run out of sand in 5 years. Now, he believed that, but actually the role of government in driving big economic transformations is central. I think it's most CEOs I talk to, most CFOs, where they think about these things, would argue that business cannot do these things on its own. Even if you bring the multiple hundreds of or thousands of businesses, in the case of the Global Compact, if you bring them together, they still can't drive true system change on their own. You have to have government action. You have to have political will. So one of the interesting things that we're starting to see is, for a long time, you talked about activists, the questioner talked about campaigners. For a very long time, they tried to keep business out of politics because they did not trust business leaders to do the right thing if they were lobbying. Now we've got to have business come back into politics and do the right thing, really push for systemic change, but to do it transparently so we can see what they're doing and understand what they're managing to do and not. And some trust may actually be rebuilt in that way.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about the workforce. So the question is, there's an issue to be tackled. Industry is transforming with digital technologies, and at the same time, we need to train workforce for the future of the work. However, this process is not synchronized. There will be significant skills gap. And then the questions they would like to ask your opinion on this issue with reference to regeneration approach, which is a great question indeed. Yeah, I mean.
It is. And I think, the digitalization of the economy, the global economy, is one of the biggest transformative influences of our lifetimes. And the technology, as we all know, keeps changing. Now, the people who change fastest are the younger people. In some cases, they don't even need to go to college or university or whatever to pick up the necessary skills. But I think we are in a very challenging time. I think if you look across our part of the world, I mean, from my country to yours and beyond, young people are being shaken out of the workforce. They're finding that the jobs that they had expected, even if they'd been trained in university, are not necessarily there in the way that they would have expected them to be. So I think, again, governments have a very major role and a responsibility to deliver in bringing younger people into the workforce, because we know one of the things that COVID-19, apart from just shaking younger people out of the workforce and much older ones as well, but one of the things it's done is to really drive digitalization. So, many of us are working now from our homes. We're using computer technology in ways that we wouldn't have previously imagined. And the question is coming up now, do we ever go back completely to the way that we were. And I don't think we will. I think the economy is beginning to shift in some very profound ways. I think younger people have a much better sense of how that might play out and how we might operate that in the right way. And that's one of the reasons why I think, however we do it, we've got to bring younger people through very fast into decision making. And where I've seen that happen, it's almost always a success.
Okay, thanks again. And another question, of course, we have, by the way, many questions. You say that we are talking about changing the whole system. How can we reach a market or an ideological shift with the existing leaders who don't care about cooperation, sustainability, or young people?
Yeah, it's a big question. When you look at Brazil, you look at Indonesia, you look at India, you even look at Turkey or the United Kingdom. We've got leaders who are just a little bit different than we would actually need them to be. Now, I think that's inevitable. I think that's a symptom of a decaying, a breaking down economic and political order. And in some ways, I don't think that's going to change very fast. Some of the populists are feeding on the pandemic and some of the problems. And it's extraordinary to see Donald Trump managing to survive, given the terrible performance of his government in addressing these sorts of issues. So I think a new generation of political leaders will come up. It's already starting to come through, and they will think differently. They will behave differently. I think, for example, if I think about the United States, I do not see Joe Biden as part of that new generation. Again, I think he's part very much of an older generation. And I think one of the things we're going to see, and I really am uncomfortable about it, but in country after country, we're going to see rivalry between the generations, between older people. I'm a baby boomer, I'm 71. Many of my colleagues are retiring, expecting a pension. I'm not. I'm expecting to work for at least another 10 to 15 years, because I think these are going to be the most exciting, the most challenging, and the most dangerous of my entire working career. And I don't want to see my generation, for example, just dumping this on younger people, saying, we tried, we were environmentalists, over to you. This is something that's a pan-generational challenge, and where we've got to work all the generations together. And we've got to start doing that very fast, because otherwise I think younger people are going to become really quite angry. So political leadership is essential, but political leadership doesn't have to come always from politicians. It can come from business leaders, it can come from campaigners and activists, it can come from young people. Think about Greta Thunberg. Who would have thought a 15-year-old schoolgirl would end up telling the World Economic Forum and the United Nations what to do? It's extraordinary. And I hope we'll see a lot more of that.
Yeah, the young people are already very angry, and we also see a lot of brands who have really some let's say, political character and marketing campaigns they run. And again, we have quite many questions, and I would like to share them. Throughout the pandemic, we have had to adapt to some changes real fast. What kind of adverse effects will those have on our health, psychology, environment in long term? And what kind of responses should we develop for those? For example, masks mean compulsory use of plastic as an immediate solution we have to come up with. But how sustainable is it?
That's a very interesting question. I wouldn't be surprised if it was asked by a woman. I mean, it's I shouldn't have said.
I wouldn't either.
And so you think about the psychological impacts and emotional impacts of this, and you also think about plastics because of the equipment that's used and the way in which those plastics are now appearing very widely in the environment. On the psychological side, I think the damage to younger people could be very much larger over time than we actually imagine it will be. Being taken out of school, being confined to the home, and so on, and not perhaps building the social skills quite as quickly as they might otherwise have done. I also think there is this great sense of fear, and you know, just everyone wearing masks is not the most peaceful and encouraging a sight for children to have. So I think we've got to be very careful not to firstly frighten younger people with the pandemic, and then very quickly after that, it's going to come the climate emergency. And so are we simply taking these young people and pushing them into a future where so many things are going to go wrong? I think, unfortunately, the answer is we are. I think it's a betrayal of their interests. And it's why I think older people, and all of us in a way, really have to step up now. We did a conference in London in January, 300 people. We had Aviva Investors, a big financial fund, as the co-host. And across the wall, the message was, in huge letters, was step up or get out of the way. And I think that is the message that we have to not just give to the wider world, we have to bring it back into our own organizations and address it to ourselves. Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing enough of it? Are we doing it fast enough? And I think very often we'll find we could do better.
Yeah, changing questions always help things again. And the last two questions, let me, do you see a change in the existing NGO models? Are they agile enough to cope with the existing issues?
I think the sustainability industry, including the NGOs and activist organizations, is probably the industry that needs more disruption and more structural change than any other industry. I'm saying that partly to be provocative, but you know, I grew up with NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, Oxfam, and so on. I love them. I love the character of the people, the stamina, the courage of the people who drive these organizations. But they've struggled quite often to come in alongside the business community and work constructively with the business community. Now, I think a growing number of them have done, and it's blurred because you think about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. That's an NGO. So, you know, it's the definitions are harder, but in terms of activists and people who go out in the streets, I don't think that we'll ever stop needing people to demonstrate. I think that's a basic human right. I think politically it's important that it happens. When my own country took its suicidal decision to come out of the European Union, I was, and my daughters were out on the streets. Didn't make very much difference, but you know, I think that's a human right. I think we should use it. I think NGOs will always be important. I think they'll always be a crucial voice politically, and also a training ground for younger people. Some of the people who are more idealistic and need to sort of have a bit of experience before they can then come into the sort of perhaps the rather more commercial world or government.